Hello and welcome to this episode of Compensation Insider. So today I want to talk about how I find it interesting, the evolution of how GCC-based companies are shifting their attention towards employee experience. So basically, I was blessed to deliver the same training back in March and in September of this year, online, mostly through a GCC-based audience. And this was with Caliber Academy. So GCC, for those who don't know, is the Gulf Cooperation Council. It is made up of Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, Oman, and Bahrain. And back in March, when I first delivered the session, everybody was still thinking about and asking me questions about cost control, how to adapt sales incentives to the turmoil in the market, whether it was positive or negative. And it was a massive shift in September when I saw that the delegates in the class were asking me the same question as my clients were asking me, and also, you know, my readers and people who follow my blog. So I got a lot of questions about how CompenBen can support talent acquisition, you know, retention schemes, recognition, managing promotions, and the like. So I think that's quite interesting because countries in the GCC, for the first time since their creation about 50 years ago, face a completely different world of recruitment. Traditionally, those are labor markets where a vast percentage of the working population is made up of expats. So those are non-citizens who are hired on a local contract and work for the private sector. Some also work in the government or semi-government. Most of the GCC nationals work in government or semi-gov institutions. So, for example, 66% in Saudi. Kuwait has a target goal of 100% of Kuwaitization, but they're at 81% at the moment. And for the first time in their history, those countries have not been able to depend on a constant influx of migrants to fill their needs. It used to be that everyone and their grandmother wanted to work in those oil-rich countries in the Gulf. You had the Indian subcontinental Asians and also some Africans nowadays who had an opportunity of taking care of their whole family by, you know, taking on some unskilled positions in, you know, construction and manufacturing organizations. You had the non-GCC regional Arabs and the Filipinos filling the positions in service and retail jobs, and they were able to sometimes escape, you know, the harrowing economic conditions in their own home countries. And you tend to have Westerners and highly educated Indians and Pakistanis going into highly paid managerial expertise roles. But many of those expats lost their jobs and were eventually sent back to their home countries. There were, during COVID, there were special evacuation flights, or also they waited, and then when the border started to reopen a little, they were able to leave the country. But at the same time, the borders were closed, not just to tourists, but also to those who would be migrants, you know, because the countries are trying to contain the pandemic. So when the market started to pick up again, all of a sudden, companies realized that they had to look for people who were already inside the country. And there was nobody coming in like in the past. And so what they did is that they first started by trying to poach staff from other organizations. And to be honest, some employees, and especially GCC citizens, completely benefited from that. Also, some experienced staff in all sorts of roles, you know, from executives to customer facing, because they were able to jump from one employer to another every few months to gain a little bit more salary. And in Saudi Arabia, the situation became so critical that the government issued a new rule that within government and semi-government entities, no one could be poached if they had less than 1 year of tenure at their current employer. But it's not just government realizing that this was a futile course. Companies also started to realize that while they were hiring from their competitors, their own employees were being poached as well. So obviously this is not sustainable in the long run. And it's been a rude awakening for some organizations. Instead of saying to their employees, like many of them did in the past, if you're not happy with your salary or not happy with your working conditions, you can leave. There are 3,000 people waiting outside the door to take your job. But for the first time now, companies have to start considering things from the employee side. How can they make their staff enjoy working with them so that they won't be too tempted to jump ship? And this is compounded by a very specific situation in our part of the world. In their 2021 State of the Global Workforce, Gallup identified that employees in the MENA region, Middle East and North Africa, have been the most affected globally by COVID, as self-reported. And also they feel more stress and worry more than the global norm, and lead on a global level in the feelings of how many people feel anger and sadness on a daily basis. So this is really, really bad. And now that's the situation, whether real or perceived by employees, perception is reality. So now companies, for the first time, need to identify who they really need to retain the most. They might have to implement retention schemes. They have to ensure that everyone feels valued and recognized. They want to reward and promote the staff that brought the most value during the darkest times of lockdown. They have to learn to let go of control a little bit and allow some flexibility in working conditions. So, for example, flexible working hours or even hybrid work, which, to be honest, traditionally has not been at all frequent in the GCC because the relationship has been more one of surveillance rather than one of collaboration and trust. So companies start to realize that they need to educate line managers away from being those like kind of petty supervisors and bottlenecks for sign off on every small decision to becoming, enablers, coaches and supporters of their employees. It's a difficult transition for many organizations that were focused on a traditional top-down managerial approach, where employees were there to take orders and execute, and not there to bring their best selves and their ideas and their creativity and their suggestions. So I'm hopeful that the pandemic will bring these organizations permanently into a managerial approach, which is based on trust, collaboration, empowerment, and innovation, which would be more in line with, 21st century models. Because if they don't, they will eventually lose their edge. There will always be a place where things can be produced for a lower cost or through automation. And so it's going to be difficult, and especially if their best employees move to employers that they feel respect them more as human beings. So it's going to be interesting in the coming few months and years to see what will be the impact and the duration of that shift in managerial models that need to take place in the organization. I hope you find that useful, and if you have any comment or question, please share in the comments below, and I will be happy to engage in conversation with you. Thank you very much, and see you next week for Compensation Insider.